Thomas Bennett had driven through Wyoming winters for 40 years, but he had never seen the sky turn that particular shade of gray. It looked like iron, cold and unforgiving, pressing down on the earth with the weight of something ancient and furious. The radio crackled with warnings about the polar vortex sweeping down from Canada, telling people to stay indoors, to avoid travel unless absolutely necessary. Tom gripped the steering wheel of his Ford pickup tighter, his breath misting in the cab despite the heater blowing full blast. He was out here because the cattle needed feed, because storms like this didn't care about convenience, and because leaving livestock to starve wasn't something a Bennett had ever done. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wind screamed across the open prairie, driving snow sideways in sheets so thick that the world beyond his windshield became a white void. Highway 191 stretched ahead like a pale scar through nothing, and Tom squinted through the blizzard, searching for the turnoff to his ranch. 8 more miles, maybe 10 in this weather. His fingers ached from gripping the wheel, and his chest felt tight with the kind of cold that settles deep in old bones. He was 58, widowed 3 years now, and every winter seemed harder than the last without Ellen beside him to share the burden. That's when he saw them. At first, they looked like dark boulders in the whiteness, shapes that didn't belong in the emptiness of the feedlot beside the highway. Tom slowed the truck, tires crunching over packed snow, his heart beginning to hammer for reasons he couldn't yet name. The shapes moved, barely. One lifted what might have been a head, then dropped it again as though the effort cost too much. Tom's breath caught in his throat, and he yanked the wheel hard to the right, pulling off onto the shoulder where the abandoned feedlot sprawled behind a broken fence. He killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, broken only by the howl of wind against metal. Through the storm, he could see them more clearly now. 3 horses, standing together in a tight cluster, their bodies pressed against each other for warmth that wasn't enough. Snow clung to their backs in thick blankets, ice crusted their manes, and even from this distance, Tom could see the terrible angles of their ribs, the way their legs trembled beneath them, the hollow desperation in their stillness. His hand found the door handle and pushed. The cold hit him like a fist, stealing his breath, burning his lungs. He stumbled forward through knee-deep drifts, the wind tearing at his coat, snow stinging his face. Closer now, he could hear them. One made a sound, weak and rattling, more plea than whinny. Another stood with her head hanging so low her muzzle nearly touched the frozen ground. The third, a gray horse with ice clinging to his forelock, stood between the others as though shielding them from the wind, his body shaking violently. Tom stopped 3 feet away, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. These weren't wild mustangs caught in the storm. Their coats, beneath the ice and filth, showed the dullness of long neglect. Their hooves were cracked and overgrown. Their bodies spoke of months without proper feed, without shelter, without care. But it was their eyes that broke something inside him. When the bay mare lifted her head, when those dark eyes met his through the swirling snow, recognition slammed into Tom like a runaway truck. He knew that white blazed down her face. He knew the small scar above her left eye from a gate accident 10 years ago. He knew her because Ellen had loved her, had trained her, had spent countless hours in the arena teaching children how to ride on her steady back. "Dancer," Tom whispered, the name ripping from his throat. The mare's ears flicked forward weakly at the sound of her name, and in that moment, Tom's world tilted and collapsed. He looked at the gray gelding, saw the distinctive dappling pattern beneath the grime, the proud arch of his neck even now when he could barely stand. Duke, and the chestnut mare beyond them, her coat the color of autumn leaves dulled by winter, her gentle eyes glazed with exhaustion. Penny, all 3, the horses Ellen had poured her heart into, the horses from her therapeutic riding program, the ones who had carried children with disabilities, who had healed broken spirits with their patience and grace. The horses Tom had paid Mountain View Equine Sanctuary $18,000 to care for after Ellen died, after the program closed, after he couldn't bear to look at them anymore because they reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Tom's knees hit the snow, the cold seeping through his jeans instantly, but he felt nothing except the roar of blood in his ears and the crushing weight of betrayal. He had trusted them. He had signed papers, shaken hands, believed the glossy brochures showing green pastures and heated barns. He had driven away 3 years ago believing he was giving these horses the retirement Ellen would have wanted for them, the peace they deserved. Instead, they were here, freezing, starving, dying in a blizzard in an abandoned feedlot 8 miles from his own ranch. Dancer took a trembling step toward him, her legs barely supporting her weight. She stretched her neck out, nostrils flaring, catching his scent. Tom reached up with shaking hands, pulling off his gloves, and pressed his palm against her ice-crusted cheek. She was so cold, too cold. Her breath came in shallow gasps, steam rising weakly from her nostrils. Behind her, Duke swayed, his eyes rolling white, and Tom realized with horror that the gray gelding wasn't standing guard. He was holding himself upright through pure stubborn will, his body positioned to block the worst of the wind from reaching Penny, who stood behind him with her head lowered, no longer even trying to fight. "No," Tom said, his voice breaking. "No, no, no. Not like this. Not you three." The storm screamed around them, and Tom knew with terrible certainty that if he didn't act now, if he didn't get them somewhere warm within the hour, they would become frozen statues in this godforsaken place. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The truck had a trailer hitch, but no trailer. The ranch was too far. Even if he called for help, no one could reach them in this wideout. Dancer's legs buckled slightly, and she caught herself, but barely. Tom Bennett had spent his entire life making decisions in crisis. When a calf was breech, when a fence went down in a storm, when cattle scattered during a lightning strike. He knew how to think through panic, how to find solutions when every option looked impossible. But standing in that blizzard, looking at 3 horses who should have been safe, who should have been warm and fed and cared for, his mind went blank with rage and grief. Then training kicked in. Assess. Prioritize. He pulled his phone from his pocket with numb fingers, praying for signal. 1 bar flickered weakly. He dialed the only number that mattered, the one he should have called 3 years ago before making the biggest mistake of his life. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Vince," Tom shouted over the wind. "I need you at the old Mercado feedlot off 191. Now, bring your truck, bring blankets, bring anything that can keep a horse alive for 20 minutes. Dr. Vincent Hayes didn't ask questions. He had been Tom's friend since they were both 10 years old, riding bareback through these same plains in summer. He heard the desperation in Tom's voice and simply said, "I'm 15 minutes out. Don't let them lie down." The line went dead. Tom shoved the phone back in his pocket and turned to the horses. 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. Dancer was shaking so violently her whole body seemed to vibrate. Duke's breathing had become labored, each exhale a visible cloud that the wind tore away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instantly. Penny hadn't moved at all. Tom grabbed the emergency blankets from his truck, the thin silver survival sheets that looked pathetic against the fury of the storm but were all he had. He approached Dancer first, speaking softly, the words Ellen used to use when a frightened horse needed calming. "Easy girl, easy now. I've got you. I'm so sorry. I'm so damn sorry." He draped the blanket over her back, tucking it around her chest and hindquarters as best he could. The wind immediately tried to tear it away, and Tom used baling twine from the truck bed to secure it, his fingers so cold they barely functioned. Dancer stood still, too exhausted to even flinch at his touch, and that scared him more than if she'd tried to bolt. Duke next. The gelding's eyes tracked Tom's movement, and there was something in that gaze, some flicker of the proud ranch horse he'd once been. Tom draped the second blanket over him, secured it, then moved to Penny. The chestnut mare didn't respond when he touched her. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing so shallow Tom had to press his ear against her ribs to confirm she was still alive. "Come on, Penny girl," he whispered, wrapping the last blanket around her. Don't you quit on me. Ellen wouldn't forgive me if you quit. The mention of his wife's name broke something loose in Tom's chest, and he felt hot tears freeze on his cheeks as soon as they fell. Ellen had found these horses broken in their own ways. Dancer had been a failed racehorse, too slow, discarded at 5 years old. Duke had been a ranch horse worked until he was lame, then abandoned. Penny had been pulled from a hoarder's property, half-starved even then. Ellen had rehabilitated them, loved them, gave them purpose, and Tom had let them end up right back where they started. Headlights cut through the storm, and Tom's heart leaped. Vince's diesel truck came rumbling up the road, pulling a stock trailer behind it. The veterinarian was out of the cab before the engine died. A tall man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from 50 years of Wyoming winters. He took one look at the 3 horses and his expression went hard. Jesus Christ, Tom. How long have they been out here? I don't know, Tom shouted back. I just found them. Vince, these are Ellen's horses. The ones I sent to Mountain View. Vince's eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed with fury. But there was no time for questions or rage. He moved to Penny first, pressing his stethoscope against her chest through the blanket. His face grim in the harsh light from the truck's headlamps. Her heart rate's too slow. Core temperatures probably in the 80s. She's hypothermic and malnourished. They all are. He looked at Duke, then Dancer, his jaw tight. We need to get them warm, but slowly. Too fast and we'll shock their systems. Can you back the trailer up? Tom ran for his truck, started the engine, and carefully backed it close to the trailer Vince had opened. Together, they created a makeshift chute using panels Vince kept for emergencies. Loading the horses was agonizing. Each step seemed to cost them everything. Dancer went first, Tom leading her with gentle pressure on her halter, speaking Ellen's words, Ellen's tone, anything to keep her moving. She stumbled twice but made it into the trailer. Duke followed, his pride still intact even as his body failed him. He walked up the ramp with his head high, and Tom had to look away from the dignity in that gesture. But Penny wouldn't move, couldn't move. Her legs had locked, and no amount of coaxing could convince her to take even one step. We'll have to carry her, Vince said, already moving to her hindquarters. On 3, they lifted together, Tom taking her front half, Vince supporting her rear. She weighed nothing, this horse who should have been 1,200 pounds, and that terrified Tom more than anything else. They got her into the trailer, laid her on deep straw Vince had already spread, and Vince immediately began working. Heated blankets from a battery pack, for fluids to combat dehydration, glucose for energy. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of 4 decades in veterinary medicine, but Tom could see the worry in the set of his shoulders. Where are we taking them? Vince asked, taping down in 4-line. Tom didn't hesitate. Home. The barn's heated. Ellen's arena is still there, climate-controlled. We can set up in there. They secured the trailer and climbed into their respective trucks. The drive back to Bennett Ridge Ranch took 25 minutes that felt like hours. Tom kept glancing in his rearview mirror at the trailer swaying behind Vince's truck, praying it would make it, praying they would make it. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had intensified, visibility dropping to mere yards. When they finally pulled through the gates of the ranch, Tom felt a surge of relief so strong it made him dizzy. The barn loomed ahead. Its red paint faded, but its structure solid. He'd kept it maintained even after Ellen died, kept the heat running even though he rarely went inside anymore. Now he was grateful for the instinct that had kept him caring for a building full of ghosts. They unloaded the horses into the barn's main corridor, then into the adjacent indoor arena Ellen had insisted they build. It was a luxury for a cattle ranch, but she'd needed it for her program, needed a space where kids could ride regardless of weather. Now it would save these horses' lives, if they could be saved at all. Vince worked through the night while Tom assisted, following orders, holding IVs, monitoring temperatures. They set up heat lamps, careful to position them far enough away to avoid thermal shock. They offered small amounts of warm mash, though only Dancer had the strength to eat. Duke stood in his stall, swaying but upright, his eyes fixed on Penny in the stall across from him. Penny lay in the deep straw, her breathing labored. Vince had done everything he could. Fluids, medications, warming blankets, electrolytes. But her body had been pushed too far, deprived too long. As dawn broke and the storm finally began to ease, Penny's breathing became more ragged, more desperate. Tom knelt beside her, his hand on her neck, feeling her heartbeat flutter beneath his palm. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Ellen trusted me to take care of you, and I failed. I'm so sorry, girl." Penny's eye rolled toward him, and in it Tom saw not accusation but something that looked like understanding, like forgiveness he didn't deserve. Her breathing hitched once, twice, then stopped. The heartbeat beneath Tom's hand stilled, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. Vince placed a hand on Tom's shoulder but said nothing. There was nothing to say. One of three was gone. Tom stood slowly, his knees protesting, his whole body aching with exhaustion and grief. He looked at Dancer, who had her head over the stall door, ears pricked toward Penny's stall. He looked at Duke, who had finally allowed himself to lie down, his gray coat steaming in the warmth of the arena. 2 out of 3 remained. And Tom made a vow standing there in the early morning light, with his wife's horse dead in the straw and her 2 others barely clinging to life, that he would find out what had happened. He would find out who had done this, who had taken his money and his trust and abandoned these animals to freeze and starve. He would burn down whatever corrupt system had allowed this to happen, even if it took everything he had left. But first, he had to keep Dancer and Duke alive. Everything else could wait. The first light of morning came pale and cold through the arena windows, casting long shadows across the straw-covered floor. Tom sat on an overturned feed bucket, his back against the wall, watching Dancer and Duke with eyes that burned from lack of sleep. Vince had left an hour ago to get more supplies, promising to return before noon. The veterinarian had also taken Penny's body, wrapped carefully in canvas, to be cremated. Tom would scatter her ashes in the pasture where Ellen's therapeutic riding program had once operated, where children had learned to trust again on the back of a gentle chestnut mare. But now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Tom found himself unable to move, unable to do anything except stare at the 2 horses who had survived the night. Dancer stood in her stall, head lowered, occasionally taking small bites of the soaked hay pellets Vince had prepared. Her body still trembled, though whether from cold or trauma or simple exhaustion, Tom couldn't tell. Duke lay in deep straw, his gray coat drying in patches, his breathing more regular now but still concerning. Every few minutes, he would lift his head toward Penny's empty stall, as if expecting her to appear, and the confusion in his eyes cut Tom deeper than any blade. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow blanketed everything in white, softening the harsh edges of fence posts and equipment sheds, turning the ranch into a Christmas card version of itself. But Tom felt no appreciation for the beauty. All he could see was the cruelty of it, the bitter irony that his wife's horses had nearly frozen to death less than 10 miles from the ranch where they should have been all along. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a harsh intrusion into the silence. Tom pulled it out, expecting Vince, but the number was unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe to accept the call. "Mr. Bennett?" The voice was young, female, trembling slightly. "My name is Rebecca Winters. I'm a veterinary student at the university in Laramie. I need to talk to you about the horses you found yesterday." Tom straightened, exhaustion forgotten. "How do you know about that?" There was a pause, then a rush of words. "I've been feeding them. Not enough, I know, but what I could afford, what I could carry without anyone noticing. I saw your truck yesterday during the storm. I was coming to check on them when I saw you loading them into the trailer. I followed you back here. I've been sitting in my car outside your gate all night, trying to work up the courage to knock on your door." Tom stood, his heart beginning to pound. "You've been feeding them? How long? How long have they been in that feedlot?" "Since October," Rebecca said, and Tom heard tears in her voice. "Maybe earlier. I only found them in October when I was doing field research for my thesis. They were already in bad shape then, and I didn't know what to do. I reported it to animal control, to the sheriff, to everyone I could think of. No one would help. They said the property was in foreclosure, that jurisdiction was unclear, that they didn't have the resources. So I started bringing hay when I could, and water in the summer before everything froze. October. 5 months. These horses had been abandoned and starving for 5 months while Tom went about his life, feeding his cattle, maintaining his ranch, believing they were safe and warm at Mountain View Equine Sanctuary. The facility he'd paid $18,000. The facility that had sent him quarterly updates with photos of horses in green pastures. Horses that now he realized had never been Dancer, Duke, or Penny. Stock photos, probably. Lies wrapped in glossy paper. "Come to the house," Tom said, his voice rough. "If you've been sitting out there all night, you need coffee and warmth. And I need to hear everything you know." 20 minutes later, Rebecca Winters sat at Tom's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her young face haggard with exhaustion and guilt. She was 24, she told him, in her final year of veterinary school, specializing in large animals because she'd grown up on a ranch in Montana and knew what it meant to care for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes carried the kind of sadness that came from watching suffering you couldn't stop. "I should have done more," she said, staring into her coffee. "I should have stolen them. Should have called the news. Should have done something other than just bringing hay and hoping someone would notice." Tom shook his head. "You kept them alive. Without you, I would have found 3 frozen bodies yesterday instead of 2 living horses. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours to carry." Rebecca looked up at him, and Tom saw hope flicker in her expression. "The chestnut mare. Penny. Did she make it?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Rebecca's face crumpled, and she set down her coffee before she could spill it. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried so hard." "I know," Tom said. "And she knew. I could see it in her eyes before she died. She knew someone had been trying to help." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall and the hum of the refrigerator. Then Rebecca pulled a folder from her backpack, the kind students used for class notes, and slid it across the table to Tom. "This is everything I could find," she said. "Documents, photos, timeline. When I first found the horses, I started investigating. I'm not a detective, but I know how to research, and I wanted to understand how this could happen. Mr. Bennett, Mountain View Equine Sanctuary doesn't exist anymore. It closed in August, 2 years after you sent your horses there." Tom opened the folder with hands that had started to shake again. Inside were printouts from the Wyoming Secretary of State website showing Mountain View's business registration as dissolved. There were news clippings from small-town papers about horses being seized from a facility in Colorado, another in Montana, all connected to the same management company. There were satellite images of the Mountain View property showing empty paddocks, a barn with a collapsed roof. No horses visible anywhere. How did they stay in business for 2 years? Tom asked, though he already suspected the answer. "They moved the horses," Rebecca said. "Not to better facilities. To auctions, to kill buyers, to anywhere they could make money. They kept just enough horses on the property for the quarterly photos. Rotated them in and out so owners wouldn't recognize that the same 5 horses appeared in every update. By the time they officially closed, most of the horses were already gone. Yours ended up at that feedlot because the property owner was given them for free, told they were old ranch horses, not worth much. He put them out to pasture and forgot about them. When his operation went bankrupt last year, the horses just stayed there. No one wanted to deal with them." Tom felt something cold settle in his chest, something that went beyond anger into a realm he didn't have words for. These weren't crimes of passion or accidents of negligence. This was systematic, calculated betrayal. Mountain View had built their business model on the trust of people like him, people who loved their animals enough to pay for their care but who couldn't keep them for whatever reason. They had weaponized that love, turned it into profit, and left the horses to suffer when there was no more money to be made. "The other horses," Tom said slowly, "the ones in your research, what happened to them?" Rebecca's expression darkened. "Most are gone, dead or disappeared into the slaughter pipeline. I found records of 47 horses that went through Mountain View during its 2 years of operation. I can only account for 12, and most of those were in terrible condition when they were seized by authorities. Your 3 are the only ones I found still in Wyoming. The rest vanished. 47 horses. 47 families who had trusted, who had paid, who had believed their companions would be cared for. Tom thought of Ellen, of how she would have reacted to this news. She would have been furious, yes, but more than that, she would have been heartbroken. She had believed in the fundamental goodness of people, had built her therapeutic program on the idea that humans and horses could heal each other. This would have shattered something essential in her worldview. But Ellen was gone, and Tom was the one left holding the pieces. He looked at the folder, at Rebecca's exhausted face, at the window beyond which Dancer and Duke were fighting for their lives in the arena. He thought about Penny, who had died in the straw because she'd been pushed too far, who had carried disabled children with infinite patience and deserved so much better than she'd received. I need to see the facility, Tom said. Mountain View. I need to see where they were supposed to be. Rebecca nodded. I can take you. It's about 40 miles north, near the Montana border. But Mr. Bennett, there's nothing there. Just empty buildings and broken fences. Whoever ran that operation, they're gone. Disappeared with the money. Someone knows where they went, Tom said, his voice hard. Someone signed the paperwork to dissolve the business. Someone owns the property. Someone profited from this. And I'm going to find them. He stood, his decision made. Vince would be back soon to care for Dancer and Duke. Rebecca had been awake for over 24 hours and needed rest. But Tom felt more alert than he had in years, as if the rage burning in his chest was fuel enough to keep him going indefinitely. He had spent 3 years in a fog of grief, going through the motions of living without actually engaging with life. Now, looking at the evidence of betrayal spread across his kitchen table, he felt something wake up inside him that he'd thought had died with Ellen. Purpose. Direction. A fight worth fighting. Get some sleep, Tom told Rebecca. There's a guest room upstairs. When Vince gets back, I'm going to that facility, and I'd like you to come with me. You know more about this than anyone. But you need rest first. Rebecca looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She nodded, gathered her folder, and let Tom show her to the guest room. When he came back downstairs, he found himself drawn to the window that overlooked the arena. He could just see Dancer through the glass, her head visible over the stall door, ears pricked forward as if listening to something only she could hear. Tom pressed his palm against the cold glass. I'll make this right, he said quietly. For you, for Duke, for Penny, for all of them. Promise. The sky outside was clearing, revealing a blue so bright it hurt to look at directly. The storm had passed, but Tom knew another one was coming. The kind that wasn't made of snow and wind, but of truth and consequences and the reckoning that happened when someone finally decided to stand up and demand answers. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. First to his ranch manager, letting him know he'd be away from the cattle operation for a while, that he needed to focus on something else. Then to his lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chun who handled his business affairs and who would know how to navigate the legal complexities of what he was about to do. Finally, he called the Whitefish County Sheriff's Office and left a detailed message about what he'd found, about the horses, about Mountain View, about everything Rebecca had discovered. By the time Vince's truck pulled up the drive, Tom had a plan forming. It wasn't complete, and it would probably change as he learned more, but it was a start. He met Vince at the barn, helped him carry in supplies, updated him on Dancer and Duke's condition. The gelding had stood during the night, had even eaten a little, which Vince said was a good sign. Dancer's temperature was rising slowly, her body starting to recover from the hypothermia that had nearly killed her. They're tough, Vince said, running his hands over Duke's legs, checking for swelling or injury. Tougher than they should have to be. How long were they out there? Since October, at least, Tom said, and explained about Rebecca, about her months of trying to help, about everything she'd discovered. Vince listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Mountain View, he said finally. I remember when they opened. Big advertising campaign, promises of premium care, lifetime guarantees. I warned some of my clients to be careful, to visit the facility first, but the prices were competitive and the marketing was slick. I think I knew 3 or 4 people who sent horses there. Rebecca has records of 47, Tom said. We need to find out who else was affected. We need to contact them, let them know what happened to their horses. Vince nodded slowly. That's going to be hard, Tom. A lot of those owners probably don't want to know. They paid for peace of mind, for the ability to believe their horses were happy somewhere. Telling them the truth is going to hurt. Living with lies hurts more, Tom said. Ellen taught me that. She always said the truth was a gift, even when it cut deep. These people deserve to know what happened. They deserve the chance to demand justice. The 2 old friends stood in the arena, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and the lingering scent of the medications Vince had used through the night. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt under a sun that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the darkness they were discussing. Tom thought about the road ahead, about the fights that were coming, about the possibility that he might fail, that the people responsible might never face consequences. But he also thought about Dancer's eyes when she'd recognized his voice in the storm, about Duke's stubborn refusal to lie down even when his body was shutting down, about Penny's last breath and the forgiveness he'd seen in her gaze. He thought about Ellen, about the way she'd fought for every horse in her program, about the love she'd poured into creatures the world had discarded. I'm going to the facility today, Tom said. Rebecca's coming with me. I need to see it with my own eyes. Then I'm going to start making noise, loud enough that someone has to listen, loud enough that this can't be hidden anymore. Vince studied him for a long moment, then clapped him on the shoulder. Ellen would be proud of you. She always said you had more fight in you than you showed. Guess she was right. Tom felt his throat tighten. He hadn't cried when Ellen died, had been too numb, too lost. He hadn't cried during the funeral or the months that followed. But standing here in the arena she'd built, fighting for the horses she'd loved, he felt tears burning behind his eyes and didn't try to stop them. I let her down, he said quietly. I let these horses down. I won't do it again. Then don't, Vince said simply. Keep fighting. Keep standing. That's all any of us can do. Rebecca woke just after noon, disoriented and stiff from sleeping in unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The storm, the horses, following Tom Bennett's trailer through the blizzard, sitting in her car outside his gate until dawn broke and courage finally overcame fear. She sat up, rubbing her face, and heard voices coming from somewhere below. When she came downstairs, she found Tom and Dr. Hayes in the kitchen, bent over paperwork spread across the table. Both men looked up as she entered, and Tom gestured to the coffee pot. Help yourself. We've been going through everything you brought. Vince knows 2 of the other owners who sent horses to Mountain View. We're trying to build a list. Rebecca poured coffee and joined them at the table. The documents she'd compiled over months of research looked different in daylight, more damning somehow. There were bank statements she'd obtained through a Freedom of Information request, showing large deposits into Mountain View's accounts followed by rapid transfers to offshore holdings. There were complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau, all dismissed or ignored. There were testimonials on the facility's now-defunct website, glowing reviews that Rebecca suspected were fabricated entirely. The property records show Mountain View was owned by a holding company called Horizon Livestock Management, Vince said, tapping a printout. That company is registered in Delaware, which means the actual ownership is hidden behind layers of corporate structure. But the listed agent is a man named Gerald Morse. No photo available, no social media presence. Nothing. It's like he doesn't exist. Tom stared at the name, committing it to memory. Gerald Morse, the man who had shaken his hand 3 years ago, who had walked him through paddocks filled with healthy horses, who had promised with apparent sincerity that Dancer, Duke, and Penny would live out their days in comfort and peace. Tom remembered him as middle-aged, well-dressed, articulate. He'd had a firm handshake and direct eye contact, All the markers of trustworthiness that con artists learn to fake. "We need to go to the facility," Tom said. "I need to see it." They took Tom's truck, the three of them cramped in the cab, driving north on roads still slushy with melting snow. The landscape rolled past in shades of white and brown, the beauty of the previous night's storm already fading into mud and slush. Rebecca directed them, occasionally consulting her phone's GPS, though she'd made this drive enough times that she probably could have found it blindfolded. The facility appeared after 40 minutes of driving, set back from the main highway down a rutted gravel road. Tom felt his stomach clench as they approached. The sign was still there, hanging from a wooden arch over the entrance, though one side had come loose and now it dangled at an angle. Mountain View Equine Sanctuary, where horses retire in peace. The irony of that slogan made Tom's jaw tighten. They drove through the open gate, Tom noting that the chain that should have secured it was broken, hanging useless from one post. The main barn came into view, and Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. The building was large, well-constructed, the kind of facility that would have cost serious money to build. But the roof had partially collapsed on one side, and several windows were broken. Snow had drifted through the openings, piling up inside what should have been warm, dry stalls. Tom parked near the barn and climbed out slowly, his boots crunching on frozen gravel. The silence was absolute except for the wind moaning through the broken structure. No horses nickered at their arrival. No dogs barked. The place felt abandoned in a way that went beyond simple emptiness. Felt cursed. Rebecca led them toward the barn, pushing open the main door with a creak that echoed through the cavernous space. Inside, stalls lined both walls, maybe 30 in total. They were empty now, but evidence of past occupation remained. Hay scattered across the concrete floor, water buckets overturned and cracked, lead ropes hanging from hooks. Tom walked slowly down the center aisle, looking into each stall, his mind reconstructing what this place must have been like when it was operational. "The paddocks are out back," Rebecca said, her voice echoing strangely in the empty barn. "That's where they took the photos for the quarterly updates. There's good lighting there in the afternoon, made everything look green and lush even in winter." They walked through the barn and out the back door into a large outdoor area surrounded by wooden fencing. The paddocks were expansive, Tom had to give them that. Plenty of room for horses to move, to graze, to live comfortably. Except there was no grass, just bare dirt and patches of ice. The water troughs were dry and cracked. The loafing sheds designed to provide shelter from weather had lost their roofs, offering no protection at all. Tom walked to the far fence line and stood there, looking out over the empty expanse. He tried to imagine Dancer here, Duke, Penny. Tried to picture them grazing peacefully, tails swishing at flies in summer, standing together for warmth in winter. But the image wouldn't form. All he could see was neglect, abandonment, the slow decay of a place that had been designed to look good in photographs but never intended to actually care for the animals it claimed to serve. "How many were here when you first found this place?" Tom asked Rebecca without turning around. "None," she said quietly. "It was already empty when I started investigating. But I talked to neighbors, people who lived along the highway. They said the horses started disappearing about 6 months before the facility officially closed. One week there'd be 20 horses in these paddocks, the next week only 10, then 5, then none. When people called asking about their horses, they were told they'd been moved to a sister facility in Montana for the winter, or that they'd been relocated for better grazing, or that they'd died of natural causes and been cremated." Vince made a sound of disgust. "And no one questioned it? No one demanded proof?" "Some did," Rebecca said. "But Mountain View always had answers. Death certificates from local veterinarians who turned out not to exist. Transfer papers with forged signatures. Photos of horses they claimed were the ones that had been moved, but the markings were never quite right. They were good at what they did, which makes it so much worse. This wasn't amateur hour. This was professional fraud." Tom turned to face them, and both Rebecca and Vince took an involuntary step back at the expression on his face. His eyes had gone cold, his jaw set in a way that made him look like the rodeo rider he'd been 40 years ago, the man who'd stared down 2,000-pound bulls without flinching. "Show me where they kept the records," he said. Rebecca led them to a smaller building adjacent to the main barn, what must have been the office. The door was unlocked, and inside they found the detritus of a business shut down in haste. Filing cabinets stood open, their contents scattered across the floor. A desk sat against one wall, its drawers pulled out and emptied. Computer cables lay tangled on the surface, but no computers remained. Whatever hadn't been taken had been destroyed, papers ripped and scattered, photos torn from walls. Tom knelt and began gathering papers, sorting through them with methodical patience. Most were useless, old invoices for hay and grain from suppliers who had probably never been paid, employment records for workers who might never have existed. But then his hand closed on something that made his breath catch. It was a photograph, partially torn but still intact enough to see clearly. 3 horses stood in one of the paddocks, the lighting golden and perfect, the grass green beneath their hooves. He recognized them instantly despite the time that had passed. Dancer, Duke, Penny. This was one of the photos from his quarterly update, the proof he'd received that his horses were thriving in their retirement. Except now, standing in this abandoned facility, Tom could see details he'd missed before. The grass was too green, too uniform, clearly photoshopped. The shadows fell at impossible angles. And in the background, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a building that didn't match anything on this property. This photo hadn't been taken here at all. It had been staged somewhere else, then digitally altered to look like it came from Mountain View. Tom stood slowly, holding the photograph in hands that shook with rage. Every quarterly update he'd received over 2 years had been a lie. Every dollar he'd paid had gone not toward caring for Ellen's horses but toward maintaining a fiction elaborate enough to fool people who desperately wanted to believe. "Tom," Vince said carefully, watching his friend's face, "we should go. There's nothing here for us. We need to focus on the horses that are still alive, on getting them healthy." But Tom wasn't listening. He was staring at the photograph, at the 3 horses who should have been safe, at the elaborate deception that had led to Penny's death and nearly killed Dancer and Duke. He thought about Ellen, about how she'd believed in the goodness of people, about how her trust had been so complete that she'd built an entire program around the idea that humans could be counted on to do the right thing when given the chance. She'd been wrong. Or maybe the world had changed since she'd been in it. Maybe the greed and cruelty that had always existed had simply found new, more sophisticated ways to operate. Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out absently, still staring at the photo. It was a text from his ranch manager. A simple message that under normal circumstances would have been routine. "One of the heifers is calving. Might need help." Tom almost ignored it, almost told himself that the cattle could wait, that this was more important. But then he thought about responsibility, about the animals depending on him, about the fact that his anger and need for justice couldn't come at the expense of creatures who had done nothing wrong. "We should head back," he said finally, his voice flat. "I need to check on the heifers, and Dancer and Duke need monitoring." They drove back to Bennett Ridge Ranch in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Rebecca stared out the window at the passing landscape, feeling the weight of months of helplessness pressing down on her. She tried so hard to help, had spent her own limited money on hay and grain, had made countless phone calls and filed endless reports. And none of it had been enough. Penny was dead, and Dancer and Duke had come within hours of following her. Vince thought about the other owners, the ones whose horses had vanished into the slaughter pipeline or died alone in forgotten places. He'd been practicing veterinary medicine for 40 years, had seen the best and worst of how humans treated animals. But this level of systematic betrayal, this calculated exploitation of grief and trust, made him feel old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with his age. Tom thought about Ellen. He'd spent 3 years trying not to think about her, trying to bury his grief in work and routine, trying to convince himself that he was fine, that he'd moved on. But now, driving back to the ranch with evidence of betrayal in his pocket and 2 dying horses in his barn, he realized he'd never actually grieved at all. He'd just gone numb, shut down, stopped engaging with anything that required him to feel. Now he was feeling everything at once, and it threatened to overwhelm him. When they arrived back at the ranch, Vince went immediately to check on Dancer and Duke while Tom dealt with the calving heifer. The birth was difficult but successful, and by the time Tom returned to the house, washed the blood and birth fluids from his arms, and changed into clean clothes, the sun was beginning to set. He found Rebecca in the barn, sitting on a hay bale outside Dancer's stall. The mare had her head over the door, and Rebecca was stroking her nose gently, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said when she heard Tom approach. "I know I'm being unprofessional. Veterinarians aren't supposed to get emotional about their patients." Tom sat down beside her, his joints protesting after the long day. Ellen used to say that anyone who could work with animals without getting emotional wasn't someone she wanted anywhere near her horses. Caring isn't a weakness, Rebecca. It's the only thing that matters. They sat in silence for a while, watching Dancer. The mare's eyes were brighter than they'd been that morning, her breathing more regular. She was eating consistently now, small amounts every few hours, and her body temperature had stabilized. She was going to survive, Vince had said. It would take time and she'd never be the same physically, but she would live. Duke was doing even better. The gelding had stood for several hours, had walked around his stall, had even vocalized a few times, that low nicker horses made when they wanted attention or food. His spirit seemed unbroken despite everything he'd endured, and Tom found hope in that stubborn resilience. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "We have evidence of fraud, of animal cruelty, of systematic neglect. But Gerald Morse is a ghost, the facility is abandoned, and the company that owned it is probably already dissolved and reformed under a new name somewhere else. How do we make this right?" Tom pulled the torn photograph from his pocket and stared at it in the fading light. 3 horses in a field that didn't exist. A lie so carefully constructed it had fooled him for 2 years. "We tell the truth," he said simply. "We tell it loud enough and often enough that someone has to listen. We find the other owners, the other horses, and we show people what happened here. We make it impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to sweep under the rug like it doesn't matter." "And if no one listens?" Rebecca asked, her voice small. Tom looked at her. This young woman who'd spent months trying to save horses no one else cared about, who'd used her own money and time to fight a battle she couldn't win alone. He thought about Vince, who'd dropped everything to help despite being semi-retired, who'd worked through the night without complaint because old friendships and moral obligations outweighed convenience. He thought about Dancer and Duke, who'd survived against impossible odds because they'd had each other, and because their will to live had been stronger than the circumstances trying to kill them. "Someone will listen," Tom said with certainty he didn't entirely feel. "Because the alternative is accepting that this is just how the world works now, that trust means nothing, that promises can be broken without consequence. I don't accept that. Ellen wouldn't have accepted it. And I don't think you do either, or you wouldn't have spent 5 months feeding horses in a blizzard." Rebecca wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. "Your wife sounds like she was an amazing person." "She was," Tom said, and for the first time since Ellen's death, the words didn't feel like they were being torn out of him. "She saw the best in everyone, believed people were fundamentally good even when they proved her wrong. I used to think that was naive. Now I think it was the bravest thing about her." Darkness had fallen completely now, and the barn lights cast warm pools of yellow across the concrete floor. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound was answered by another, then another, until the night was full of their wild music. Tom stood, his decision made. "Tomorrow we start making calls. We contact every owner we can find, tell them what happened, ask them to add their voices to ours. We go to the newspapers, the television stations, anyone who might care. We make enough noise that the authorities can't ignore us anymore." Rebecca stood as well, squaring her shoulders. "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'm here." They shook hands, formally, sealing a partnership neither of them had anticipated but both recognized as necessary. Then Tom walked Rebecca to her car, watched her drive away down the long gravel drive, and returned to the barn where Dancer and Duke waited. He spent the night there again, sleeping in fits and starts on a cot he'd set up in the tack room. Every few hours, he woke and checked on the horses, offered water, adjusted blankets, whispered reassurances into the darkness. And sometime near dawn, as exhaustion finally claimed him completely, Tom dreamed of Ellen. She was standing in the arena, the one she'd built for her therapeutic riding program, and she was smiling. Around her were horses, dozens of them, all the ones that had passed through her program over the years. They grazed peacefully, their coats shining with health, their eyes bright with contentment. Ellen looked at Tom, and though no words passed between them, he understood what she was telling him. Keep fighting, keep standing. Some promises can't be broken, even by death. When Tom woke, sunlight was streaming through the barn windows, and Dancer was standing at her stall door, watching him with eyes that held recognition and something that looked remarkably like trust. He rose stiffly, walked to her stall, and pressed his forehead against her neck. "We're going to make this right," he whispered. "For you, for Duke, for Penny, for all of them. Promise." And this time, Tom knew it was a promise he would keep. The calls started the next morning. Tom sat at his kitchen table with Rebecca beside him, a list of names and phone numbers spread before them that Vince had helped compile. These were the owners, or at least the ones they could track down, who had entrusted their horses to Mountain View Equine Sanctuary. Some numbers were disconnected. Some people had moved and left no forwarding information. But enough answered that by noon. Tom's voice was hoarse from repeating the same terrible story over and over. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Shock, disbelief, anger, grief. Some people hung up on him, unable or unwilling to hear what had happened to the animals they'd loved. Others broke down crying, demanding details Tom couldn't provide because the horses were simply gone, vanished into a system designed to erase them. A few thanked him, their voices thick with emotion, grateful to finally know the truth even though the truth was devastating. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Foster, had sent her Arabian gelding to Mountain View 4 years ago when arthritis made it impossible for her to care for him properly. She listened to Tom's explanation in silence, then said quietly, "I knew. Deep down, I think I always knew something was wrong. The photos they sent never looked quite right, and when I asked to visit, they always had excuses. But I wanted to believe so badly that he was happy somewhere, that I was doing the right thing. I convinced myself the doubt was just guilt." Tom understood that feeling intimately. He'd done the same thing with Dancer, Duke, and Penny, pushed down his instincts and questions because believing was easier than investigating, because trust was more comfortable than suspicion. By the end of that first day, they'd reached 17 owners. 12 were willing to add their voices to what Rebecca had started calling the reckoning. 5 wanted nothing to do with it, preferred to maintain whatever peace they'd constructed around their decisions. Tom couldn't judge them for that choice, though he wished they'd reconsider. The more people who spoke out, the harder it would be for authorities to dismiss this as an isolated incident. That evening, Tom's lawyer Patricia Chun arrived at the ranch. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, originally from California, who'd moved to Wyoming for the space and stayed for the people. She'd handled Ellen's estate after her death, had guided Tom through the legal complexities of grief with patience and competence. Now she sat across from him in the living room, reading through Rebecca's compiled evidence with an expression that grew increasingly grim. "This is extensive," Patricia said finally. "Well documented, thoroughly researched. Rebecca, if you ever get tired of veterinary medicine, you'd make an excellent investigator." Rebecca managed a tired smile. She'd barely slept in 3 days, running on coffee and determination, but she wouldn't leave the ranch until this was finished. She'd taken up residence in Tom's guest room, spending her days helping Vince care for Dancer and Duke, her evenings compiling more evidence and making more calls. "The problem," Patricia continued, "is that proving fraud and pursuing criminal charges are 2 different things. The business is dissolved, the property abandoned, and Gerald Morse is effectively untraceable. We can file complaints with the Wyoming Attorney General, with the Department of Agriculture, with animal welfare organizations. But without a defendant, there's no one to charge, no one to prosecute." Tom had expected this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still felt like a blow. So they just get away with it? 47 horses dead or disappeared, hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen, And there are no consequences? I didn't say that, Patricia replied. Criminal prosecution might be difficult, but civil action is another matter. We can sue the holding company, Horizon Livestock Management, for breach of contract and fraud. Delaware corporate law makes it difficult to hide ownership completely. With enough pressure and the right subpoenas, we can pierce the corporate veil and find out who actually profited from this operation. It won't bring the horses back, but it might prevent them from doing this again under a different name. How long would a lawsuit take? Rebecca asked. Years, probably, and it would be expensive. We're talking depositions, expert witnesses, potentially going to trial if they don't settle. Tom, I'll be honest with you. This would consume your life for the foreseeable future. Are you prepared for that? Tom looked toward the window that faced the barn where Dancer and Duke were slowly healing. He thought about Penny, about the moment she died in the straw with his hand on her neck. He thought about Ellen, about the dream he'd had of her standing among peaceful horses. He thought about Margaret Foster's voice on the phone, the relief mixed with pain when she'd said, I knew. Yes, he said simply. I'm prepared. Patricia nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. Then I'll start the paperwork. But Tom, while the legal process moves forward, you need to keep pressure on from another angle. Public attention. The law moves slowly, but public outrage moves fast. If you can get media coverage, if you can make this story visible enough, it forces authorities to act more quickly. That's where Natalie Cross entered the picture. She was a reporter for the Rocky Mountain Herald, the regional paper that covered 6 counties across northern Wyoming. Rebecca had contacted her 3 days after finding the horses, had sent her copies of the evidence, had explained the scope of what they'd uncovered. Natalie had been skeptical at first. Reporters learned to be wary of stories that sounded too dramatic to be true. But she'd agreed to come to Bennett Ridge Ranch and see the horses for herself. She arrived on a cold afternoon 2 weeks after Tom had found Dancer, Duke, and Penny in the blizzard. She was in her mid-30s, practical in fleece and hiking boots, carrying a camera and a recorder with the easy competence of someone who'd been doing this work for years. Tom met her at the gate and led her to the barn where Vince was conducting his daily examination. Dancer had gained weight, though she was still dangerously thin. Her coat had begun to regain some shine, and her eyes held an alertness that had been absent in those first terrible days. Duke was doing even better, moving around his stall with increasing confidence, occasionally tossing his head in a gesture that reminded Tom achingly of the proud ranch horse he'd been years ago. Natalie stood at the stall door for a long time, just watching Dancer. She didn't take photos immediately, didn't fire off rapid questions. She simply observed, and Tom respected her for that restraint. Finally, she turned to him. Tell me everything. From the beginning. They talked for 3 hours. Tom, Rebecca, and Vince all contributing pieces of the story. Tom described the moment he'd recognized Dancer in the storm, the horror of realizing where his horses had been for months. Rebecca explained her attempts to help, the bureaucratic dead ends she'd encountered, the evidence she'd compiled. Vince provided the medical perspective, detailing the horses' conditions when they'd arrived, the long road to recovery they still faced. Natalie recorded it all, occasionally asking clarifying questions, pushing for specific details. When they finished, she turned off her recorder and looked at each of them in turn. This is going to make people angry, she said. Horse people, animal lovers, anyone who's ever trusted a business to care for something they loved. It's going to spread fast once it's out there, and you need to be ready for that. Your life is about to get very public, Tom. Are you okay with that? Tom thought about the quiet years since Ellen's death, the comfortable isolation he'd built around himself, the way he'd avoided attention and engagement with anything beyond his ranch boundaries. Going public meant giving that up, meant inviting scrutiny and judgment, meant standing in a spotlight he'd never wanted. But it also meant that Penny's death wouldn't be meaningless. It meant that Dancer and Duke's survival would serve a purpose beyond their individual recovery. It meant that the other 44 horses whose fates remained unknown might finally receive acknowledgement, that their owners might find closure or justice or at least answers. I'm okay with it, Tom said. The article ran 4 days later on the front page of the Rocky Mountain Herald. The headline was stark and effective. Trusted sanctuary left horses to starve. Owners demand answers. Below it was a photograph of Dancer, taken from an angle that showed both her current frailty and the determination in her eyes. The story laid out everything: the fraud, the abandonment, the systematic deception. It named Mountain View, named Horizon Livestock Management, included quotes from multiple owners and from Vince about the horses' medical conditions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Herald's website crashed from traffic within hours of the story posting. Tom's phone rang constantly with reporters from larger outlets requesting interviews. Animal welfare organizations issued statements condemning what had happened and calling for investigation. The Wyoming Attorney General's office announced they were reviewing the case. Social media exploded with hashtags and outrage and demands for justice. Within a week, Natalie had published a follow-up piece identifying 3 other facilities across Montana, Colorado, and South Dakota that appeared to operate under the same model as Mountain View. All had closed suddenly, all had left horses unaccounted for, all traced back to holding companies with similar corporate structures. The pattern was undeniable, and the story grew from local outrage to regional scandal to national conversation about accountability in the animal care industry. Tom found himself giving interviews to television stations, speaking with investigators, answering questions from owners across multiple states who were realizing their horses might have met similar fates. It was exhausting and overwhelming, and sometimes felt futile when another dead end emerged or another horse's fate proved untraceable. But he kept going because stopping would mean accepting defeat, and he'd promised Dancer, Duke, and Penny that he wouldn't do that. The breakthrough came 3 months after that first article. A whistleblower emerged, a woman named Diane Kurtz who had worked as a bookkeeper for Horizon Livestock Management. She contacted Patricia Chen directly, bringing with her financial records that showed exactly where the money had gone and who had profited. Gerald Morse was real, it turned out, but he was a front for 3 men who operated the network of fake sanctuaries as a business model. They'd moved constantly, opening facilities under different names, running them until owners became too numerous or suspicious, then dissolving and reforming somewhere else. With Diane's evidence, Patricia filed criminal complaints that finally had teeth. The Attorney General's office opened formal investigations in 4 states. 2 of the men were located and arrested. The third remained at large, but his assets were frozen, his ability to operate curtailed. It wasn't complete justice, not with so many horses dead or disappeared, but it was more than Tom had dared hope for in those early days. Through it all, Dancer and Duke continued healing. Dancer would never be the barrel racing champion she'd been in her youth. The months of starvation had left permanent damage, weakened bones and a heart that struggled with exertion. But she could walk through the pasture, could graze peacefully, could stand at the fence and watch the sunset with an expression that looked remarkably like contentment. Duke thrived. His body recovered more completely, his spirit seemingly unbroken by everything he'd endured. He took to following Tom around the ranch, curious about the cattle, interested in the daily rhythms of farm life. Tom sometimes caught himself talking to the gelding the way he used to talk to Ellen, sharing thoughts and observations, finding comfort in a presence that listened without judgment. Rebecca finished her veterinary degree and accepted a position with a large animal practice in Mineral Springs, close enough to visit Bennett Ridge Ranch regularly. She and Tom had become unlikely friends, bound together by shared trauma and purpose. She still carried guilt about not being able to save Penny, and Tom suspected she always would. But she channeled that guilt into advocacy, speaking at veterinary conferences about recognizing signs of institutional abuse, writing articles about owner responsibility and the importance of verification over trust. One afternoon in early August, 6 months after he'd found the horses in the blizzard, Tom stood in Ellen's arena watching Dancer and Duke graze in the attached paddock. The space that had sat empty for 3 years was alive again, filled with purpose. He'd taken in 2 more horses since the story broke, both pulled from situations similar to what his 3 had endured. The arena that Ellen had built to heal children was now healing horses, and Tom found poetry in that transformation. Rebecca joined him at the fence, silent for a moment before speaking. "Margaret Foster called me yesterday," She started a foundation in her gelding's memory. It's going to fund surprise inspections of retirement facilities, create accountability where there wasn't any before. She asked if you'd be willing to serve on the board. Tom considered this. 6 months ago, he would have said no without hesitation, would have retreated into his comfortable isolation. But standing here in the space Ellen had created, with horses she'd loved alive and healing behind him, he found himself nodding. Tell her yes. Ellen would have wanted that. Hell, Ellen would have started it herself if she were still here. I think she'd be proud of what you've done, Rebecca said quietly. Not just saving Dancer and Duke, but everything else. The investigations, the legislation being proposed, the changes happening across the industry. None of that would have occurred if you'd stayed silent. Tom thought about Penny, about the forgiveness he'd seen in her eyes before she died. He thought about Ellen's dream, about her standing among peaceful horses and silently telling him to keep fighting. He thought about the 44 horses whose fates remained unknown but whose stories were finally being told, finally matching to someone beyond their individual owners. I did what anyone should have done, Tom said. The tragedy is that I was the exception, not the rule. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, watching Dancer and Duke graze peacefully. The gray gelding lifted his head and whinnied, a sound full of life and vigor, and Dancer answered with a soft nicker. Tom smiled, the expression feeling natural now in a way it hadn't for years. He'd lost Ellen. He'd lost Penny. He'd nearly lost Dancer and Duke. But standing here in the arena his wife had built, watching horses heal in a space designed for healing, Tom understood that some losses created spaces for new beginnings. Some promises could be kept even after the person who inspired them was gone. Some fights were worth fighting even when victory looked impossible. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside the barn, the other 2 rescued horses stirred in their stalls, secure in the knowledge that they were safe, that they mattered, that someone had finally noticed they needed help. Tom turned away from the paddock and headed back to the house, Rebecca walking beside him, already discussing plans for tomorrow, for next week, for all the work that still needed doing. Behind them, Dancer whinnied again, and the sound carried across the ranch like a promise being kept, like a vow being honored, like hope refusing to die even in the coldest winter storm. The courtroom in Cheyenne was smaller than Tom had expected, paneled in dark with that absorbed sound and made everything feel muted, compressed. He sat in the gallery beside Rebecca and Vince, watching lawyers shuffle papers and speak in low voices to the judge. Patricia Chun sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight and confident, flanked by attorneys representing 12 other horse owners who had joined the consolidated lawsuit against Horizon Livestock Management and its principals. This wasn't a criminal trial, those cases were still winding through separate proceedings in multiple jurisdictions, but it mattered just as much. This was about accountability in the clearest possible terms, about forcing the people who had built their wealth on broken promises to answer for what they'd done. The 2 men who'd been arrested sat at the defense table in suits that probably cost more than Tom's truck, their expressions carefully neutral, their lawyers whispering strategies that would try to minimize damage, deflect blame, negotiate settlements. Gerald Morse wasn't among them. He remained missing, probably using money stolen from trusting horse owners to fund a comfortable exile somewhere without extradition treaties. But his photograph sat on the evidence table, blown up to poster size, his face finally visible to everyone who'd been searching for him. Tom stared at it, trying to reconcile the professional headshot with the man who had shaken his hand and promised Ellen's horses would be cared for with dignity and compassion. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Tom had been warned this would be technical, dry, focused on contract law and corporate structure rather than emotional appeals. But when Patricia stood to make her opening statement, she managed to weave both together in a way that made the financial malfeasance inseparable from the animal suffering it had caused. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about trust, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the small courtroom. My clients trusted the defendants to honor contracts that promised lifetime care for horses they loved. They paid substantial sums, in some cases their entire savings, because they believed they were purchasing peace of mind. Instead, they purchased elaborate lies. She walked the judge through the evidence, the corporate shell games, the falsified quarterly reports, the systematic movement of horses from facilities into slaughter pipelines or abandonment. She presented financial records showing millions of dollars flowing through Horizon's accounts over 5 years, with only a fraction spent on actual animal care. The rest had been distributed to the principals, hidden in offshore accounts, or funneled into new ventures that would repeat the same fraudulent model. When Patricia introduced photographs of Dancer, Duke, and Penny, Tom felt his chest tighten. There were before images pulled from Mountain View's promotional materials, showing healthy horses in lush pastures. Then the after images, the ones Natalie Cross had taken that first day at Bennett Ridge Ranch. The contrast was devastating, undeniable proof of neglect so severe it bordered on torture. The defense attorneys objected, argued the photos were inflammatory and prejudicial. The judge overruled them. This was a civil case about damages, and the condition of the horses was directly relevant to calculating those damages. Tom watched the defense team exchange glances, saw the moment they realized their carefully constructed narrative of unfortunate business circumstances wouldn't survive contact with images of starving animals. The trial lasted 3 days. Owner after owner took the stand, describing their decisions to place horses in Mountain View's care, their reasons for trusting the facility, their growing concerns when visit requests were denied or quarterly reports seemed inconsistent. Margaret Foster testified about her Arabian gelding, her voice steady despite obvious emotion, describing how she'd convinced herself that her doubts were just manifestations of guilt rather than legitimate warnings. Vince provided expert testimony about the horse's medical conditions, explaining in clinical detail what months of starvation and exposure did to equine bodies. He described hypothermia, muscle atrophy, organ damage, the cascading failures that occurred when basic care was withheld. He explained why Penny had died despite their best efforts, how her body had been pushed beyond the point where recovery was possible. Rebecca testified about finding the horses in the feedlot, about her months of attempted intervention, about the bureaucratic walls she'd encountered at every turn. She spoke about the night of the blizzard, about following Tom's trailer through the storm, about sitting in her car outside his gate trying to summon courage to knock on his door. Her youth and obvious dedication made her testimony particularly effective, a contrast to the cynical profiteering the defendants represented. Tom's testimony came on the second day. Patricia led him through his history with the horses, his wife's therapeutic riding program, the decision to send Dancer, Duke, and Penny to Mountain View after Ellen's death. He described his certainty that he was doing the right thing, the relief he'd felt believing they were safe and cared for. Then he described finding them in the blizzard, the recognition that had stopped his heart, the terrible understanding of how completely he'd been deceived. "Mr. Bennett," Patricia asked, "can you describe the moment you realized these were your horses?" Tom looked at the jury, at the 6 people who would help decide this case. "Dancer lifted her head when I got close. She was barely alive, could hardly stand, but she heard my voice and responded to it. That's when I knew. That's when I understood that every quarterly report, every photo, every reassurance I'd received for 3 years had been a lie. And that understanding, that betrayal, it was almost worse than seeing them starving. Because it meant I'd been paying people to neglect them, funding my own horses' suffering without knowing it." "How did that make you feel?" Tom was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Like I'd failed the most important promise I'd ever made. My wife loved those horses. She poured her heart into rehabilitating them, giving them purpose, ensuring they'd never suffer again. And I let them end up right back where they started, abandoned and starving. I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." The defense tried to paint Tom as an unreliable narrator, suggested his grief over his wife's death had colored his perceptions, implied that proper due diligence would have revealed Mountain View's inadequacies. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of documentation Rebecca had compiled. There was no ambiguity in the evidence, no room for interpretation that favored the defendants. When the trial concluded, the judge took 2 days to render a verdict. Tom spent that time at the ranch, working with the horses, trying not to think too hard about outcomes he couldn't control. Dancer and Duke had settled into comfortable routines, their bodies mostly healed even if psychological scars remained. The 2 additional rescued horses had integrated well, and Tom found himself considering taking in more, transforming Ellen's therapeutic arena into something new but equally purposeful. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Patricia's voice was calm, but Tom could hear satisfaction underneath. "We won. Full judgment in favor of the plaintiffs. $23 million in compensatory and punitive damages." Tom sat down heavily on the porch steps, the phone pressed to his ear. $23 million. It was an abstract number, too large to feel real, but it represented validation, acknowledgement that what had happened mattered, that broken promises had consequences. "What happens now?" he asked. "Collection will take time," Patricia explained. "They'll appeal, try to reduce the judgment, hide assets. But we have mechanisms to pursue that. Liens, seizures, forensic accounting. They won't escape this, Tom. It might take years, but they'll pay." The money, when it eventually came, was divided among the plaintiffs based on a formula that accounted for both financial loss and emotional damages. Tom's portion was substantial, over $2 million. He sat with the check for a long time, thinking about what Ellen would want him to do with it. The answer came easily. He established the Ellen Bennett Memorial Equine Sanctuary, a nonprofit organization dedicated to rescuing horses from neglect and abuse situations. He purchased the old Mercado feedlot where he'd found Dancer, Duke, and Penny, the place that had nearly been their grave. With Rebecca's help and Vince's medical expertise, he transformed it into a state-of-the-art rescue facility with heated barns, spacious paddocks, and a staff trained in rehabilitation of traumatized horses. Margaret Foster's Foundation, the one dedicated to surprise inspections and accountability, merged with Tom's sanctuary to create a comprehensive approach. They would rescue horses while simultaneously working to prevent the conditions that required rescue in the first place. Other plaintiffs from the lawsuit contributed portions of their settlements, creating an endowment large enough to sustain operations indefinitely. The facility opened 18 months after Tom had found the horses in the blizzard. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a surprisingly large crowd. Reporters who'd followed the story, owners who'd lost horses to Mountain View and similar facilities, advocates who saw this as a model for what accountability could look like. Tom stood at the podium, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its necessity, and spoke about Ellen, about her belief in second chances, about the horses who deserved them. Dancer and Duke attended the ceremony, groomed until their coats shone, standing calmly while visitors approached and cameras flashed. They'd become ambassadors of sorts, living proof that recovery was possible, that even the worst neglect didn't have to be a death sentence. Tom watched them interact with children who reminded him of Ellen's therapeutic riding students, saw the same gentle patience they'd shown years ago, and felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace. Rebecca had been right about the ripple effects. The case had sparked legislative action across multiple states. Wyoming passed the Equine Retirement Facility Accountability Act, requiring unannounced inspections, transparent financial reporting, and criminal penalties for operators who failed to meet care standards. Similar laws were being debated in Montana, Colorado, and South Dakota. The industry that had operated in shadows was being dragged into light, and while progress was slow, it was happening. The criminal cases concluded over the following year. The 2 arrested principals pleaded guilty to fraud and animal cruelty charges, receiving sentences of 8 and 12 years respectively. Gerald Morse was eventually located in Costa Rica and extradited, though his legal proceedings were still ongoing. Diane Kurtz, the whistleblower whose evidence had been crucial, received immunity and used her experience to start a consulting firm that helped owners verify the legitimacy of care facilities. Tom settled into his new role running the sanctuary with the same methodical attention he'd brought to ranching. The work was different, but the principles were the same: care for creatures who depended on you, maintain the infrastructure that kept them safe, plan for seasons and challenges you couldn't predict but could prepare for. He hired staff carefully, prioritizing people who saw horses as individuals rather than inventory, who understood that rehabilitation required patience and consistency. Rebecca joined the sanctuary's board while maintaining her veterinary practice. She brought cases to Tom's attention, horses she encountered in her work who needed intervention, and together they built a network of rescue and placement that stretched across the region. Vince came out of retirement completely, accepting the position of chief veterinary officer, claiming he was too invested in the mission to stay on the sidelines. 2 years after finding the horses in the blizzard, Tom stood in Ellen's arena, now the sanctuary's main rehabilitation facility, watching a new arrival take hesitant steps around the space. The mare was emaciated, scarred, her eyes holding the particular wariness of an animal who'd learned humans were sources of pain rather than comfort. But she was eating, drinking, accepting touch with increasing willingness. She would recover, given time and care and the kind of patience Ellen had always exemplified. Tom heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Rebecca approaching with a folder. "New intake request," she said. 3 horses seized from a facility in Montana. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Same corporate structure, same false promises. The operation was modeled directly on Mountain View. Tom took the folder, scanned the details, felt the old anger stir but not consume him. This fight would never be completely won, would always require vigilance and effort and the willingness to confront ugly truths. But now there were systems in place, people watching, consequences for those who chose cruelty over care. "We'll take them," he said. "Do we have stalls ready?" "We always have stalls ready," Rebecca replied with a slight smile. "That's kind of the point." They walked together back to the main office, discussing logistics, timelines, medical needs. Outside the windows, Dancer grazed peacefully in a paddock with 2 other rescued horses, her coat glossy with health, her movements unhurried and content. Duke stood under a shelter nearby, watching over the small herd with the proprietary interest of a horse who understood his role and took it seriously. Tom paused at the window watching them. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he still felt the weight of Penny's death, the guilt of promises broken and trust misplaced. But he also felt Ellen's presence in this space, in the work being done, in every horse that arrived broken and left whole. She would have approved of this use of suffering, the transformation of personal tragedy into systemic change. His phone rang, another reporter requesting an interview for an anniversary piece about the Mountain View case. Tom considered declining. He'd done dozens of interviews and the story felt thoroughly told. But then he thought about owners who might be researching retirement facilities right now, who might see the interview and ask better questions, demand more verification, refuse to accept glossy promises without proof. He answered the call and scheduled the interview. The work of bearing witness was ongoing, repetitive sometimes, but necessary. Each telling of the story was another chance to prevent it from happening again, another opportunity to honor Penny's memory and validate the suffering of the 44 horses whose fates remained unclear. Evening came to the sanctuary with the golden light particular to Wyoming summers. Staff completed their final rounds, checked water sources, confirmed that each horse was accounted for and comfortable. Tom walked the property as he did every night, a ritual that grounded him, connected him to the purpose that now defined his days. In the main barn, he stopped at Dancer's stall. The mare came to the door immediately, pressing her forehead against his chest in the gesture she'd adopted as her greeting. Tom stroked her neck, feeling the warmth of her, the solidity that proved she was real and alive and safe. "We did it," he whispered. "Not perfectly, not completely, but we did what we could. Ellen would say that's enough." Dancer's ears flicked toward his voice, and she let out a soft exhale that might have been agreement or might have been simple contentment. Tom stayed there for a while longer, his hand on her neck, his thoughts ranging across everything that had brought them to this moment. The blizzard that should have killed them but revealed them instead. The recognition that had shattered his world and rebuilt it stronger. The allies who'd appeared when needed most. The fight that had seemed impossible but proved winnable through persistence and collective effort. The losses that couldn't be undone but could be honored through action and change. Tom finally stepped back, closed Dancer's stall door, and headed toward the house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more horses needing help, ongoing battles against systems designed to exploit rather than care. But tonight, the sanctuary was quiet, the horses were safe, and the promise he'd made in a blizzard to animals who deserved better was being kept in every possible way. He looked back once at the barn silhouetted against the darkening sky, at the lights glowing from within, at the shapes of horses visible through windows. This was Ellen's legacy, transformed but intact. Her belief in second chances made manifest in wood and stone, and the living creatures who proved redemption was always possible. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear Wyoming night, and Tom walked home knowing that some stories ended not with perfect resolution but with ongoing commitment. The fight wasn't finished, might never be completely finished. But it was being fought with honor and determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept that betrayal should go unanswered. That was enough. It had to be enough. And standing there under the vast sky with Dancer's warmth still lingering on his hands, Tom believed that Ellen, wherever she was, agreed. The years moved forward with the steady rhythm of seasons changing, each one bringing new challenges and small victories to the Ellen Bennett Memorial Equine Sanctuary. Tom found himself measuring time differently now, not by calendar dates but by horses saved, rehabilitation milestones reached, policy changes implemented. The sanctuary had grown beyond what he'd initially envisioned, expanding from the original feedlot property to include adjacent parcels, increasing capacity from 12 horses to 47, a number he'd chosen deliberately to represent each animal lost to Mountain View's fraud. On a crisp October morning 5 years after finding Dancer and Duke in the blizzard, Tom walked the property with a visiting journalist from a national magazine doing a retrospective on the case and its aftermath. The reporter was young, perhaps 30, with the eager curiosity of someone who understood they were documenting something significant. Tom had agreed to the interview reluctantly, as he did most media requests now, understanding that visibility served the mission even when it made him uncomfortable. "The sanctuary's success rate is remarkable," the journalist said, consulting her notes as they walked past paddocks where rescued horses grazed in the autumn sun. 92% of intakes successfully rehabilitated and either returned to their original owners or placed in verified permanent homes. How do you account for that? Tom considered the question, watching a bay gelding who'd arrived 3 months ago skin and bones like Dancer had been, now playing with a companion in their shared space. We don't rush the process. Some facilities push horses through quickly to free up space and resources. We let each animal set their own timeline for recovery. Physical healing is only part of it. Trust takes longer to rebuild than muscle mass. They stopped at Dancer's paddock. The mare was 14 years into what should have been retirement, her body showing age but her spirit intact. She raised her head at Tom's approach, ears forward, and ambled over to the fence with the unhurried confidence of a horse who knew she was exactly where she belonged. The journalist took photos, asked permission before getting too close, showed the kind of respect for the animals that Tom appreciated. Dancer's become something of a symbol, the journalist observed. There are children's books about her, paintings, even a documentary in production. Does that feel strange, having your personal tragedy become public inspiration? Tom stroked Dancer's neck, feeling the familiar warmth beneath his palm. It felt strange at first. Ellen was private about her grief, about the struggles she faced building the therapeutic program. She wouldn't have wanted attention, but she would have wanted impact, wanted her work to matter beyond our small corner of Wyoming. If Dancer's story helps people ask better questions, demand real accountability, then the attention serves a purpose Ellen would have valued. The conversation shifted to the broader changes that had emerged from the Mountain View case. The journalist had done her research, knew about the legislation passed in 7 states, the industry standards that had been rewritten, the oversight mechanisms now required for any facility claiming to provide retirement care. She asked about the ongoing criminal proceedings against Gerald Morse, who'd finally been convicted 6 months earlier and was serving 15 years in federal prison. "Do you feel vindicated by his conviction?" she asked. Tom shook his head slowly. Vindication suggests the scales are balanced somehow, that justice makes things even. But Penny's still dead. The 44 other horses are still gone. Gerald Morse in prison doesn't change those facts. What it does is prevent him from doing this to more animals, more families. That matters, but it's not vindication. It's just consequences finally catching up. They walked to the rehabilitation barn where Vince was examining a recent arrival, a paint mare seized from a hoarding situation in Montana. Rebecca was there too, having driven up from her practice in Mineral Springs for the evaluation. The three of them had developed an efficient rhythm over the years, each understanding their role, trusting the other's expertise without needing extensive discussion. The journalist observed the examination, the gentle handling, the careful documentation of injuries and malnutrition. She asked technical questions about treatment protocols, about the psychological aspects of rehabilitation, about how they determined when a horse was ready for placement. Vince answered with the patient thoroughness of someone who'd explained these processes countless times but still found them important enough to get right. Afterward, over coffee in the sanctuary's office, Rebecca showed the journalist their placement success tracking system. Every horse that left the sanctuary was monitored through required quarterly updates from new owners, surprise visits from volunteers, and a contractual agreement that allowed the sanctuary to reclaim any animal if care standards weren't met. "We learned from Mountain View," Rebecca explained. "They exploited the gap between promise and verification. We've eliminated that gap as much as possible. Trust but verify constantly. It's more work, requires more resources, but it's the only way to ensure we're not just moving horses from one bad situation to another." The journalist seemed genuinely moved by the comprehensiveness of the approach. "This seems like it would require significant funding. How do you sustain operations?" Tom pulled out the sanctuary's annual report, a document that had grown thicker each year as their work expanded. The initial settlement provided an endowment that covers base operations. Beyond that, we have individual donors, foundation grants, and partnerships with veterinary schools that use the sanctuary for training in trauma-informed large animal care. We're financially stable, which means we can focus on quality rather than constantly scrambling for survival. What Tom didn't mention, though it was documented in the report, was that he'd contributed most of his own settlement to the endowment, keeping only enough to maintain his cattle ranch. The money had felt tainted somehow, born from suffering he should have prevented, and transforming it into ongoing rescue work had been the only way to make peace with accepting it at all. The journalist's visit concluded with a tour of the education center. A new building opened the previous year. Inside, displays chronicled the Mountain View case, explained warning signs of fraudulent facilities, provided resources for owners seeking legitimate retirement options. School groups visited regularly, and the sanctuary had developed curriculum about animal welfare, corporate accountability, and the importance of verification in any care relationship. Standing in the education center, surrounded by photographs documenting the journey from that blizzard night to the present, Tom felt the weight of Ellen's absence and presence simultaneously. She wasn't here to see this, would never know that her therapeutic program had evolved into something larger, that her horses had sparked changes that protected thousands of animals across multiple states. But her influence was visible in every aspect of the sanctuary's operations, in the patience they showed traumatized horses, in the belief that rehabilitation was always possible, in the insistence that profit should never override care. After the journalist left, Tom found himself drawn to the small memorial garden behind the main barn. Ellen's ashes were scattered here, along with Penny's, and those of other horses who died despite the sanctuary's best efforts. A simple stone marker listed names and dates, testimony to lives that had mattered, to losses that still ached despite the passage of time. Vince joined him there, the older man moving more slowly now, his own age showing in ways that made Tom conscious of time's relentless progression. They stood together in comfortable silence, two friends who'd weathered storms literal and metaphorical, who'd learned that some fights were worth the cost, even when victory was partial and hard-won. "Diane Kurtz called earlier," Vince said eventually. "Her consulting firm just helped shut down another fraudulent operation in Nebraska. Same model as Mountain View, different name. They caught it early this time, before any horses died. She wanted you to know that the systems we helped create are working." Tom nodded, absorbing this information. Early intervention, prevention rather than just response. That was progress, the kind of change Ellen would have celebrated. How many horses? 17. All accounted for, all being relocated to verified facilities. The owners were notified immediately, got their animals back or found legitimate alternatives. No one lost months wondering. No one has to carry the guilt of unknowingly funding abuse. 17 horses saved because systems had changed, because people were watching, because the cost of fraud had become high enough to deter some who might have attempted it. It wasn't enough, would never be enough while any animal suffered, but it represented movement in the right direction. That evening, Tom sat on his porch watching the sun set over the sanctuary. Horses grazed in various paddocks, some alone, some in small groups, each arrangement carefully considered based on individual needs and temperaments. Staff moved through end-of-day routines with practiced efficiency, checking water sources, distributing evening feed, ensuring every animal was accounted for and comfortable. Duke appeared from the barn, moving with the stiff-legged gait of a 23-year-old horse whose body bore the marks of hard living. He'd been retired from sanctuary duties the previous year, given a paddock where he could observe operations without the stress of new arrivals constantly disrupting his space. But he still supervised in his way, positioning himself where he could see the most activity, occasionally calling out to horses he'd helped rehabilitate over the years. Tom walked down to Duke's paddock, and the gelding met him at the gate with the dignified patience that had always characterized him. Even starving in a blizzard, Duke had maintained his sense of self, his understanding of his role as protector. Now, well-fed and safe, that same quality manifested as gentle oversight, a grandfather figure to the sanctuary's constantly rotating population. "You did good, old man," Tom said quietly, running his hand along Duke's neck. "Better than you should have had to, but good nonetheless." Duke leaned into the touch, his eyes half closed, content in the moment. Tom wondered sometimes what the gelding remembered of those months in the feedlot, if horses processed trauma the way humans did, if Duke carried psychological scars that weren't visible in his behavior. Vince said probably yes, that animals absolutely experienced lasting effects from abuse and neglect, but that unlike humans they seemed more capable of existing in the present rather than being trapped by the past. Tom envied that capacity. 5 years after finding the horses, he still had dreams about the blizzard, still woke sometimes with his heart racing, convinced he'd heard Penny's labored breathing. The guilt had lessened but never disappeared, had simply been incorporated into who he was now, a permanent reminder to question, to verify, to never assume that promises made were promises kept. His phone rang, and Tom saw Rebecca's name on the screen. "Tom, I've got a situation. Owner in Casper. She's contacted 3 retirement facilities about her mare, and something feels off about all of them. Very similar language in their materials, same pricing structure, corporate registration traces back to another Delaware holding company. I think it might be the same people trying again under new names." Tom felt the familiar tightening in his chest, anger mixed with grim determination. "Send me everything you have. I'll contact Patricia, see if the corporate structures match any patterns we've seen before. And Rebecca, tell the owner to hold off on any decisions until we can verify legitimacy." "Already did. She's actually relieved someone's taking her concerns seriously. Said she felt paranoid for questioning facilities that looked so professional." "Professional appearance is easy to fake," Tom said, thinking of Mountain View's glossy brochures, Gerald Morse's convincing sincerity. "Actual care requires sustained effort and resources most fraudulent operations aren't willing to invest." Her instincts are probably right. After ending the call, Tom remained on the porch, watching full darkness settle over the sanctuary. Lights glowed from the barns, creating pools of warm illumination that pushed back against the night. He thought about the owner in Casper, about her awareness that something felt wrong, about the fact that she had resources now to verify her concerns before making potentially fatal decisions. That was Ellen's legacy as much as the sanctuary itself. The culture of accountability, the expectation that care facilities should welcome scrutiny rather than deflect it, the understanding that loving an animal meant maintaining vigilance about their welfare even when others had assumed responsibility. These shifts in awareness wouldn't have happened without the Mountain View case, without Dancer and Duke's survival providing evidence that fraud was real and consequences were severe. Tom's thoughts were interrupted by headlights coming up the drive. A truck he didn't recognize pulled up to the barn, and a woman climbed out, looking around uncertainly. Tom walked down to meet her, noting the trailer she was pulling, the careful way she moved as if every step required courage. "Can I help you?" Tom asked. The woman turned, and he saw tears on her face. "I'm sorry to arrive without calling. I'm Lisa Hartwell. You took in my Appaloosa gelding 3 years ago. Rehabilitated him after he was seized from a neglect situation. You found him placement with a family in Sheridan." Tom remembered. The gelding had been one of their success stories. Severely malnourished when he arrived but young enough to recover fully. Storm. His name was Storm. "Is everything all right?" Lisa shook her head. "The family who took him, they were wonderful at first. But their circumstances changed. Financial trouble. And they've been cutting corners on his care. Not deliberately cruel, just overwhelmed and making bad choices. I got him back last week, but I can't keep him myself. I'm in an apartment in Billings, no facilities for a horse. I was hoping, I know this is presumptuous, but I was hoping you might take him back." Tom looked at the trailer, saw the gelding's familiar shape visible in the dim interior light. This was the fear that lived underneath every placement, that changed circumstances or failed commitment would undo the work of rehabilitation, would send horses cycling back through systems that had already failed them once. "Let's get him unloaded," Tom said. "We'll get him assessed, make sure he's healthy, and we'll find a solution. You did the right thing bringing him back rather than letting the situation deteriorate further." Together they unloaded Storm, and Tom saw immediately that the gelding had lost weight. His coat was dull, his demeanor anxious in ways that hadn't been present when he'd left the sanctuary. Not as severe as his original condition, but heading in that direction, proof that vigilance could lapse and consequences could accumulate quickly. Vince emerged from the barn, alerted by the activity, and began a preliminary examination while Tom took Lisa to the office to complete intake paperwork. She was apologetic, embarrassed, clearly viewing this as personal failure. Tom assured her it wasn't, that recognizing problems and taking action was exactly what they wanted from the network of owners and supporters they'd built. "The family in Sheridan, will they face consequences?" Lisa asked. Tom considered this carefully. "We'll assess the situation. If it was truly circumstances beyond their control and they cooperated with returning Storm, probably not beyond being removed from our approved placement list. If there was deliberate neglect or deception, we'll pursue whatever legal options apply. The goal isn't punishment for its own sake. It's ensuring accountability and preventing future harm." After completing paperwork and settling Storm in a quarantine stall for observation, Tom walked Lisa back to her truck. She thanked him repeatedly, her relief palpable, and drove away into the night. Tom returned to the barn where Vince was updating Storm's medical chart. "He'll be fine," Vince reported. "Underfed for maybe 2 months, some stress indicators, but nothing permanent. A few weeks of proper care and he'll be back to baseline." Tom nodded, but his mind was already working through implications. If the Sheridan family had struggled, how many other placements might be experiencing similar pressures? The sanctuary's verification system was good, but not perfect. Quarterly updates and occasional visits couldn't catch everything. They needed more robust monitoring, needed to build support systems for placement families so financial hardship didn't automatically translate to animal suffering. He made notes for the next board meeting, outlining ideas for an emergency support fund that could provide temporary feed assistance to placement families experiencing genuine hardship, preventing situations like Storms from developing in the first place. Prevention and intervention working together, addressing problems at multiple points rather than waiting for crisis to force action. The night had grown late, but Tom wasn't ready for sleep. He walked the property one final time, checking on Storm, stopping by Dancer's paddock where the mare dozed standing, running his hand along Duke's fence line. The sanctuary was quiet, peaceful, exactly what it was supposed to be. A place where horses who'd been failed by humans could learn to trust again, could heal in body and spirit, could move forward into futures that honored, rather than exploited their service and companionship. Ellen would have been proud of this work, Tom knew. Not just the physical sanctuary but the systemic changes, the cultural shifts, the way individual tragedy had been transformed into collective action. She'd always believed that suffering could be redeemed through meaning, that losses could birth purpose if people were willing to do the hard work of transformation. Standing in the quiet darkness, surrounded by horses sleeping safely, Tom felt closer to Ellen than he had in years. Not the sharp grief of her absence, but a sense of continued partnership, of carrying forward work that mattered to both of them. She was gone, but her influence persisted in every rescued horse, every policy change, every owner who asked hard questions before trusting, every moment of accountability demanded and received. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any artificial light out here beyond the sanctuary's buildings. Tom looked up at them, thinking about perspective, about the vastness that made individual struggles seem small while simultaneously making each life precious in its brief flicker against eternity. Penny was up there somewhere, and Ellen, and all the horses whose losses had fueled the fight for change. Their deaths hadn't been meaningless, had been transformed through action into protection for those who came after. That was enough. It had to be enough. And standing there under the Wyoming sky with rescued horses breathing steadily in the darkness around him, Tom believed it truly was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.